All right, so I want to do a quick intro to the Zoom call that I had with Manuel from Abby Games, where we talk about serialization in Unity. Particularly, he shares his approach to basically what he tried to do, similar to Recompile and Continue Playing, but he was finding it difficult to work with, and he saw the video series I had on the feature and wished he knew how that worked before he had done this. That being said, his approach, I think, is incredibly valuable. Rather than allowing you to continue making edits to the code while it's running and just trust that it works, his allows you to choose to save your state at any point in time while the game is running, and then restore that state, including with a recompile and continue playing feature, so long as it doesn't destroy the way things save. Anyway, I thought it was particularly valuable, and I wanted to just give this brief intro to it before we started, since it was during the Zoom call, I didn't give it a particularly good introduction. That being said, if anyone else has interest in sharing out some feature or part of your architecture or code, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments. This is the kind of thing that I love reviewing and finding out all sorts of different approaches to this. Because honestly, I've been considering this over and over in my head, and there is a lot of value to what he did, and I'm looking forward to doing another video with him where we go a little bit farther into a solution. So without any further ado, here's the video.
Yeah, so I'm Manuel Kersenmakers, and I work at Abby Games as the lead technician. Abby Games makes strategy games, and since the new unannounced project that we're working on, we do that in Unity.
Cool.
Yeah, so shall I just talk you through it a little bit and see if we can find some connections? So last time I told you about hot loading, and in our previous proprietary engine, AbbeyCore, in which we created our previous games, hot loading code was quite important. So whenever we would change especially UI code, but also all kinds of game logic, we would just keep the game running. We would load in Lua scripts, and then the state would be persistent, and we could just happily code away. It was one of the best features of the engine. And now that we've moved to Unity, we of course have to compile and reload. So the entire C# domain gets thrown away. And at first I tried to just, have actual hot loading to never have to re-enter play mode again. But right now that's just a dream, a faraway dream. You've shown me a lot of stuff that it is actually possible, but right now I'm doing a lot of workarounds, and one of the key features that we had in our own engine was just restarting the game. So this is not really a game. I just set something up really quickly. It's the game is just spawning some agents, some villagers, and they walk around, they change their rotation. And of course, we can stop it and play it again. And normally, if you don't have compile and continue set up, whenever you make a change in the code, it will pause and exit. So, and now I have compile and continue enabled, and it won't crash because it's just a very simple project. But if it would crash, I could easily just press R to reload the game. And for this, it's quite simple. But the idea is that in the scene, we do not rely at all on the state of it. Well, right now, only the camera is important. And then there's this bootstrapper object. Calling a game manager. It bootstraps the entire game. So no components of the game at all are in the scene. There's just a reference to this prefab called game, and it is the entire game bootstraps from there, including all the visuals and the level. So that makes it really easy, of course, to just destroy the game instance and reinstantiate it. So that's what I do if I press R, for example, and it just restarts the game. it does mean that you don't have to re-enter play mode, which can take a couple of seconds every time your code errors out or your state is corrupt.
Okay, so when you end up, let's say you make a change in the code and something does get screwed up visually in the system, you were saying that you can just hit R to restart it and it just resets all the state of the game back to the beginning?
Yeah, it restarts all the way to the beginning, so no states persisted at all.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if that already sounds useful, but this is sort of the basis. But then, of course, so we create strategy games at Epic Games, and you do create a lot of state. It's not just where is the player in the level or what's the score count, but it's what is the entire world that has been created, which characters have which levels, which skills, which places have you visited, for example. So, of course, there's saved state. We created our own serialization mechanism for that in Unity or in C#, and I can use that to just save and load the game and just return to that state. It doesn't serialize the entire scene or even the entire prefab, because a lot of the view components are not interesting. For example, the fact that a villager is represented with a cube is not interesting to us to save. So we don't want to make a big save game and save all the materials and whatnot. Instead, we just want to serialize positions. So I can load that. And in our main project, I have it set up that if I press R, I can just save the game right before pressing R and load it back up, so that you would actually have sort of hot loading, as long as the corruption of your state doesn't involve corrupting the saving process. And otherwise, you can always go to one of your most recent autosaves. So this is a little debug menu I created. I can save, make multiple saves and load from there. So I can go back and forth. And one of my ideas for this is to make sort of like a time travel feature, where you have breadcrumbs of your session, and you can always jump back to every place in your session just by clicking these breadcrumbs. That's not in there yet, but you do have ID'd save games that you can use to easily swap.
I like that. You could do that easily by, organizationally, I perceive adding the same buttons you have below game speed, just to kind of identify state that as you click save, or if you have like an auto save button, you click a different save button and it generates another button below it to say, here's save 1, 2, 3, etc.
Yeah, that would definitely be a better UX. It's always a trade-off working on the development UX.
I really like the concept that you brought up in here. So far with serialization, I've kept approaching this from, how do I actually save the state back to the scene? That's one of the things I'm focusing on. However, I've got a different approach to game design with Unity, where one of my first major attempts on programming was everything was procedurally generated. And that meant that anytime our designers came in, they couldn't really do anything directly. They had to suggest their changes, provide new graphics, but then pass that information off to us, and it became the programmer's job to do all of that. Now, I mean, with prefabs, they could still work with the prefabs directly, for instance.
Or scriptable objects, now that they're here.
Yeah, so it was, with that in mind, that was my first use case of Unity, and it became kind of a horrible experience just because of how much was there. And since then, I've put a huge amount of work when I can. There have been a few times where I'm in a project that absolutely has to be 100% procedural. But I put a lot of work to try to make sure it's designer friendly. Now, with that in mind, the key focus I wanted to get to, but I want to talk about this one in just a moment. The key focus that I personally want to get to is that when you are in the play mode and you go to actually edit something, you change something inside of the inspector, that it'll have an additional button in there or a right-click menu or something, and you can tell it to save the state of that back to the scene or the prefab, whatever it's coming from. Now, there's some issues with there, some some complications in general, just because of the fact that when you load a prefab into the scene and you clone it into there, it no longer has an understanding that it is a prefab when it's in play mode. That information gets lost. So that was an area that I wanted to work around. However, your concept, I really like the principle of it, of purposefully designing parts of your code so that the saving process just saves what it's interested in. And you can save the state of the game, reload it with everything that's important to the game at that particular time. That is a direction that I like. It requires more work. Like, one of the reasons I wanted to approach it this way was so I could go into a project that is already existing and just say, okay, here's how we can get this designer tool to work. Here's how we can get recompile and continue playing to work.
Right.
This one would require a repurpose of how a lot of different projects are coded, but I'm not opposed to that. I think that's a reasonable idea, especially when you're starting at the beginning.
Yeah, you're right. It is a lot of work, and in a greenfield project like the one we have, we can do that, or at least we can create it up from the ground. So we did do like our whole own tokenization of everything. So I really have to attach every type of data into the serialization system, and I'll take you through the serialization in a minute if you want.
Awesome. That would be that would be incredible.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in on the concept of prefabs being lost when you enter play mode, because for a while I also wanted to support editing this dynamic state of the game while being out of play mode, because the reasoning was, if it's hard to keep your changes while you're in play mode because state gets corrupt and Unity doesn't really handle code changes during play mode well, why not just keep the state in edit mode? So in theory, I can just click load and load my save game and my game while I'm in edit mode. There's nothing preventing it. I guess, I'm not sure.
Okay.
So yeah, I can apparently.
Nice.
And also, yeah, because I use the normal destroy, you cannot do that in the editor. So in the past, I've created some facade for that to just abstract the destroy behavior, depending on whether you're in play mode or not. That's right. Now it's duplicating the session, but in general, it works. And that allows you to, for one, test the load process, see if the entire load process goes through, and then also inspect your state.
Oh, so this is something, it runs in play mode, but so far it's in the editor. Is this based on code that you can run in runtime, like on a client machine? The reason I ask, the reason I ask is because if a user of a video game like this is running into a bug,
right,
they could literally hit a button and say, hey, I'm running into this bug, and it will save the state of everything inside of there and pass it back. And then you as the developer can load it up, just go back to whatever version they were based on for the code, load it up, and then you get primarily what they had.
Yeah. I mean, the save games are the same for the editor experience and the build player in the end. So in theory, players, we could attach save games of players to the crash report and then load them up either in the editor or in our own version of the game.
Now I'm really annoyed that Unity doesn't do all this stuff.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, Unity serialization is really focused on serializing the entire scene, but that is just way too big a challenge for me. And I don't know how fast that can be, but even for the complex game that we've been working on for a year now, it's really quick to just load a game. It does it in like an instant, basically, which is really nice. Of course, this doesn't animate right now. So for a while, we actually made all the most of the Unity callbacks, except for update, respond in the editor as well with the execute in editor attribute.
And then I assume the editor update function as well.
Yeah, so we didn't use the editor update, but in theory, we could have added that too, like maybe with a pause button and
Okay.
sort of re-establish play mode inside the editor, but on our own terms. But in general, the overhead of going into play mode, especially with the safe loads, proved a better option for us. So I stopped pursuing this. Oh yeah, but the reason I want to talk about it was because if you do it like this, and you use the prefab utility, instantiate prefab method, then you can actually retain the prefab connection because you're in the editor, of course. So let's see if we can do that right here, right now. So we're in the game. Let's do it here, game. So here we spawn the villagers. So all of this is weaved with the serialization, so it's not that easy to. But if we instantiate a prefab right here, we do it like this. But we could actually, yeah, the code is still there. We could actually use the prefab utility.
Okay.
Well, I'm not going to do it live right now because I haven't prepared things as well as you. But you see this line here, it's the core, the juice. If we use this while we're in the editor, and we can even do that in play mode, we can actually retain the prefab connection. Did you know this command? I guess.
Yeah, I've used that one before in another project. One of the things that we were doing is we were generating entire scenes dynamically. So it would get generated and then a designer can come in, make changes, but that would include putting in the prefabs. And I definitely remember running into the headache of, oh yeah, so it added all the prefabs. It has no idea what they are. So if you make changes, you have to rerun the entire build section for that to get it to work, which at the time was like maybe 5 or 6 minutes. So that was a pain for designers. But then switching over to prefab, finding the prefab utility was a lifesaver for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I guess you use it as an editor tool, which it's which is the goal of it. But like I would just redirect. If we're in the editor, I would just redirect all prefab instantiations to this call rather than just instantiate. And that way, our scene at runtime, even in play mode, would be filled with all kind of instantiated prefabs, which sort of gives us the ability to change that prefab. I think if we then pause it and we can actually click apply. However, it felt like a dark forest of scary messes, scary monsters, and how Unity responds to you changing prefabs in play mode. I don't remember the specifics, but the reason it's commented out here is because it was really hard to actually get this prefab concept of hot loading working, where, for example, our entire UI was built up of nested prefabs, our entire HUD. And when we changed one of these prefabs, I would just want to reload the HUD or just a single part of it. And it was really hard to get that working. Like in the end, I got it working by just destroying the entire HUD and reinstantiating it, which is good enough because a HUD is usually stateless, or at least in our case, it's stateless. But yeah, that's one of the dreams that we left alone, again, in favor of just saving and loading the game the whole time. But I just wanted to mention that because, yeah, definitely having prefabs in play mode is cool.
Yeah, this option is great. This also kind of leads me to another video series that I'll probably want to work on. Just like I did with the Recompile and Continue Playing, I didn't know the answer when I started that series. And now I'm comfortable using it and I use it all the time for my own stuff.
Yeah.
But this one with the prefabs and how you can control it even though the system is in play. When I was working with the prefab system and the prefab utilities and setting things, that was all in edit mode only. I was not doing that stuff in play mode. So, but that brings up some interesting complications of how does this actually handle? And I guess basically the purpose of the videos is just to test it all out and find out exactly what it does.
Yeah, I really like that idea of open experimentation, where you just show what you're trying to to make, and ask other people to get into that as well. So yeah, just like a few quick things to show is like we have this game speed manipulator. We've got debug toggles. So for example, if I restart the game with this toggled on, it will spawn a lot of villagers. And with this toggled off, it spawns a few villagers. And these toggles, they're really easy to access in the game, but they're not compiled in the build player. So they will be removed from that.
Are you using Odin for this by any chance?
No, I'm not using Odin at all.
Okay.
I think like for a next project, I should start working with Odin, because it feels like a lot of things I'm trying to make and do are in there. I am using naughty attributes, which does some of the things that Odin does, or at least Odin Inspector. So these debug buttons, they are just created by adding a small attribute on top of a method.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So then as long as you've got that in there and it's part of your game, then it shows up in your debug menu?
Yeah, for every instance. So for example, if I have a villager, which is the only object that I have a lot of instances for, and let's say a typical Dutch name.
I've learned something new. I've never seen a name with that spelling.
If you take one thing away from this video, it should be that. Yeah, so now for every villager that is in there, it has this update name button. And there's this, so basically this is like a skeletal view of your game model to some extent. One of my dreams is to render this in a tree view, which is like the hierarchy, but only denotes the interesting objects, like the interesting for your save game, persistent objects. But as a quick shortcut there, I've already got this button, which will select the villager that this button is rendered for in your scene. So, yeah.
I've got a suggestion for that, which I'm not sure how feasible it is, but I've seen other people doing this. You can interrupt the drawing of the hierarchy. So you can
this one here.
Yeah, so you can add new things into it. Now, I've only seen that for doing like line by line edits, and not for, say, adding some additional buttons and features at the top. But I definitely like the idea of having dynamics that your code can add new features to it, which I guess some of the existing tools for that might be there. Actually, there might be some stuff out there, some assets that you could use that already give you like the visuals, and then you can add new buttons to it, things that would show. However, I don't know how well that would work. And so far, I like this system a lot.
Yeah, thanks. I'm like, at the start, I was really curious whether I was trying something that Unity didn't support. And I've tried a lot of things that Unity doesn't really support. But right now we've been working for about half a year comfortably. Now all of it is set up. Yeah, so especially in a really large model that goes layers and layers deep, this really helps me to navigate quickly to some of the more interesting objects. So what I want to show you is the serialization system.
Yeah, I remember doing something similar to this. I was using like Newtonsoft, not identical. I was using Newtonsoft on it. Oh, nice slides.
Yeah, so I just wanted to reference quickly to this because it's an internal presentation that I use for serialization. Why I have made such a complex system for serialization. This is the reasoning for it. A lot of tutorials or assets for Unity that are about saving, they only have some low complexity levels of serialization accounted for. Like we just want to save some data like the score and the player position. Like sometimes they have these components like, oh, add this component to every object in your scene, and then you can save it. It's an interface, so you can save things of different types. it already gets a bit iffy if you want to serialize that something exists at all. Like you instantiate something and then later on you want to get it back if you load the game, even though it's not in the scene originally. If you also want to save the identity of the object because it's in a list of interfaces, like a polymorphic list, but you only,
Nice.
That's the only reference you have to it. It gets harder still. And then I feel the hardest level of serialization for a game model is an interconnected set where everything references each other, because you get a lot of load order problems. And this is the case that we have to solve daily for our strategy games. And we don't only need to solve it, but we also want to be able to quickly expand our games. We want to test out new features, and we want to be able to have them save load right away, especially because we use it in our workflow. So that's why I set up this system, basically. So let's start at the root of the game model, which is game. And it just has this code here. Oh, first of all, it's an ABI model. And like in the future, I don't know if I want to derive from something, because you can only derive from one thing. But an ABI model is basically every persistent referenceable model object. And it marries that idea of a persistent object in your save game with something that's a mono behavior and therefore visualized in the hierarchy. So that's why my save game tree, which is basically a tree of objects, is also a subset of the things in the hierarchy. That way I can always click on a villager and see what name it has. And if I update it, I can see that it works. So you've got some fields, and then basically here you say these fields need to be serialized. And rather than doing that imperatively and having a save and a load function, let's just first look at one of these methods. Rather than having a save and a load path, there's actually just a serialized data path, which gets an interface. And this method is actually called in 3 different paths: when saving the game, when loading the game, and when creating this thing for the first time, instantiating it for the first time. Sometimes it does some setup logic there. And in each of these cases, it does something differently. In the save path, it will read out this variable and write it into an archive that is maintained specifically for this object. On the load path, it reads out that archive and puts it in this variable. That's why it's a ref, past a ref. And in the creation path, it sometimes can set it like a default value. So why is there a separate function?
Yeah, and what does ontology mean? I'm unfamiliar with that word.
Yeah, I'm not like, this is just an idea that I use in my vocabulary, but like ontology, I think is the learnings of the structure of the world. And basically it's a fancy way of saying serialized structure or serialized owned objects. So you can imagine that villagers are referenced by many different things in the game. For example, a building may have a reference to a villager, but it's important to, in the way we serialize, it's important to denote which object is the owner of the villager. So which is responsible for its creation and destruction. We have single ownership in the serialization tree. And by putting this one here, like the list of villagers, it's a model list, but we can get to that later.
Oh, okay, got it.
By putting it here, I basically I announce the villagers are owned by the game, and in the future, I will be the first to deserialize them. So if the villagers end up being, for example, a polymorphic list, and I need the runtime type.
Got it.
Yeah.
So in other words, because of the fact that multiple objects can be trying to serialize a reference to a villager, you're emphasizing that this one is the actual parent that's going to spawn it. This one will hold on to the real data. The other ones will just hold on to links and references to be able to reconnect themselves.
Yes. Yeah. That's basically the gist of it. Even though they will all serialize the same thing. They will all serialize a reference to the archive. But this one has, for example, this one tells you which prefab you use to instantiate this script with, because the data is only for the script. And there's no Unity prefab attached in the save game. So,
sorry, but I'm also seeing something new in C# that I don't know what it means. The underscore for the Lambda function.
Actually, it's nothing. It's just a variable name, and by convention, it means for us this variable is not important. I could have probably better than do this. Oh wait,
that's what I always did before. But okay, you're calling out by variable name. I haven't seen it done in that way before, so I'm going to look into that later. But I figured I would ask now.
Yeah, I got it from, I think, from functional programming from Haskell.
Okay.
But the idea is that you can select a prefab dynamically based on the archive if you have a reason to use different prefabs for different instantiations. But in this case, we just have always use the villager prefab. And now the nice thing is, if other classes have a reference to the villager, for example, say every villager has a friend, I can just add that here. And I can serialize it. Without telling someone about the prefab, because I'm not responsible for instantiating it at load time. So I don't have to know the specifics of how to instantiate it.
Awesome. So what systems have you tested this on to see what it works? And what matters? Are you primarily just focusing on Windows or like Mac? Do you do mobile or anything like that?
We've only tested it on Windows PC.
Okay.
The idea is that our games are mostly for PC. We might go to consoles at some point. However, Mac and Linux we do want to support, but I see no reason why it shouldn't be supported. Like in the end, what we do is we just put everything in one big C# serializable thing. We tokenize it, the whole save game, and then.
Are you using reflection for your serialization to figure out like what fields are there?
As little as possible.
Okay.
So most of it is statically typed. Only in the case of polymorphous lists, where say you have different implementations of the villager contract, then you have to save which type you're actually saving, so that you know at load time which type to instantiate. But I try to keep everything statically. I don't know if it's necessary. I guess reflection isn't that slow, but I like to think it keeps our save load process really, really fast.
Oh yeah, I really appreciate the way that you're approaching this. My only concern on that is that I know that in some systems, like the HoloLens, when I was developing for that, and I tried doing what was it? I want to say serialization, but the part we were just talking reflection.
Right.
Reflection definitely had some issues with like HoloLens, and I know there were some other potential systems that might not work well with it. My understanding is that like Mac PC or Mac Windows and Linux are just fine. But then once you start getting out into more specific hardware, sometimes those change, and I'm not exactly sure what those are. So I figured I would call that out just to test it. But I would trust it on Mac directly on Linux and Windows, of course. It's just when you start getting out into mobile and HoloLens and some other specialty devices, they might have some issues.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the tip. I hadn't realized that there's a connection there. should check that out.
Yeah, I think it might have to do with AOT, where like all the assemblies have to be in play, but I'm not entirely certain. I remember I couldn't pull up a list of what assemblies were actually inside of the system to generate any kind of reflection off of it. However, in your case, it might not even matter because you're passing in the reference of types that you're, or the types that you're using. So that,
Exactly,
yeah, it can get the type information directly from it, and I would assume it should work, but I would just recommend testing if you want to try using this on new hardware.
right. Yeah, that might actually, like for consoles, might actually be really relevant. Okay, so I actually don't have time anymore, but there's more to show. Like, how does it work underwater? What is this thing called the model list? There are a few more complex cases we could look at, but we can save this for next time if you're interested to learn more. And I'm also just really curious about what you find of all of this.
Yeah, I'd love to do a little bit more review on this and talk it over with you. So we'll figure out another time then.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you reaching out to me in the first place on this stuff. Anyway, yeah, I'll talk to you later then.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, we'll do it over email or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
All right, so I hope you like the video. Again, I just want to call out that if you have something you want to share out, I would probably like to see it. There are so many different approaches and ways to solve these different kinds of things, and every place is likely going to come up with their own. Some elements of this type of thing I feel like Unity really should have just had built into it, like some exposing of its serialization features so that we could serialize a particular object or set of objects, or the entire scene, and just kind of have that serialization stored. Now, that being said, I understand why they didn't. They have a very fast approach to it. Does one thing, does it well. So for a lot of these features and surrounding capabilities, it's a system that a lot of us have to redevelop. And so I'd really love to find out about other people's solutions, even not just this, but to other interesting concepts as well, to how you handle particular problems inside of Unity or challenges. Anyway, if you have any that you'd like to share, please reach out in the comments or connect to me on LinkedIn and chat with me there. Depending on the topic, there's a lot of stuff that I'd really love to have some discussion on and share out on my channel. All right. Thanks for your time.